never believed in ghosts, at least not until I moved into this house by the river. My name is Sofia, and this is the story of how my life turned into a nightmare because of a legend that I thought was just a tale to scare children. It all started on a warm summer's evening. I was unpacking the last of the moving boxes when I heard it, a distant cry coming from the river. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some nocturnal animal, but there was something about that sound, something that made my hair stand on end. I approached the window, curious. The full moon illuminated the waters of the river, creating unsettling shadows between the trees. It was then that I saw her for the first time, a woman in white standing on the riverbank. Her long black hair swayed in the night breeze. I thought about calling out, asking if she needed help. But when she turned around, my blood ran cold. Her face was as pale as death, her eyes as black as bottomless pits. And that cry, now I could hear it clearly. It was a heartbreaking wail, full of pain and despair. In the blink of an eye, she was gone. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself that it was just tiredness, a hallucination caused by the stress of moving. But deep down in my heart, I knew something was wrong in that house on that river. That night, I couldn't sleep. The crying continued, distant but persistent, and with it came a whisper on the wind, Ms. Hios, Ms. Hios, my children, my children. I didn't know it then, but that vision would only be the beginning. The curse of La Llorona had found a new home, and I was about to discover the true meaning of terror. The next day, I decided to investigate. I asked the neighbors about the history of the river, about local legends. Most of them didn't talk, quickly changing the subject. But the furtive glances they exchanged told me that there was more to the story than they were willing to tell. It was Mrs. Martinez, an elderly woman who lived at the end of the street, who finally told me about La Llorona. Her voice trembled as she recounted the legend of the woman who drowned her own children and now wanders forever, crying for them. "Be careful, dear," she warned me, her eyes full of fear. "La Llorona looks for children to replace the ones she's lost, and when she finds them, no one ever sees them again." I swallowed, remembering the figure by the river. Was it just a legend, or was there something more sinister lurking in the shadows of my new home? Little did I know that I was about to find out the answer in the worst possible way. For that very night, La Llorona's cry would sound closer than ever. And this time, she wouldn't be coming alone. The following night, I couldn't sleep. Mrs. Martinez's words echoed in my mind, mingling with the distant sound of the river. I tossed and turned in bed, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. Then I heard it. Light footsteps in the corridor, almost inaudible. My heart raced. It was just me and my 5-year-old son, Miguel. He must have been asleep. "Miguel," I called, my voice trembling. There was no reply, just the oppressive silence of the night. I stood up, my legs shaking. The corridor was dark, the moonlight filtering through the curtains, creating strange shadows on the walls. "Miguel, are you there?" A childish laugh came from his room, but there was something wrong with that sound. It wasn't my son's happy, carefree laugh. It was cold, almost evil. With my heart in my throat, I opened the bedroom door. The window was open, the curtains swaying in the night breeze. And there, sitting on the edge of the bed, was Miguel. But he wasn't alone. A pale figure stood beside him, long black hair covering her face. She was humming softly, a sad, ancient melody that made my blood run cold. "Miguel!" I shouted, running to the bed. The figure turned, and I saw its face. The same empty eyes, the translucent skin like that of a corpse.
La Llorona.
She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her dead eyes, and then she disappeared. Miguel blinked, confused. "Mom? What happened?" I hugged him tightly, tears streaming down my face. "Nothing, my love. It was just a bad dream." But I knew it wasn't true. La Llorona had been there in our room next to my son, and something told me that she would be back. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Objects moved on their own. The distant crying got louder at night. And Miguel, Miguel started talking about a sad lady who visited him in his dreams. I knew we needed help, but who would believe me? Who could protect us from a legend, a ghost with a thirst for revenge? It was then that I met Carlos, a mysterious man who claimed to be a cleaner, someone who deals with the supernatural. He listened to my story with a seriousness that scared me. "The curse of La Llorona is powerful," he said, his dark eyes fixed on mine. "But there is a way to stop it, but the price may be too high." I swallowed. "What price?" Carlos smiled sadly. "To save your son, you'll have to face your own demons. Are you prepared for that, Sofia?" I looked at Miguel's picture on the wall, his innocent smile. I would do anything to protect him. Anything. "Yes," I answered, my voice firmer than I felt. "What do I need to do?" Carlos pulled a strange amulet out of his pocket. "First, we need to attract La Llorona. And to do that, we need to use her son as bait." Icy fear enveloped me again. Use Miguel as bait? It was madness. But when I heard the distant cry coming from the river, I knew we had no choice. The battle against La Llorona was about to begin, and I prayed that we would be prepared for what came next. Carlos' plan made my stomach churn. Using my own son as bait to attract a vengeful spirit seemed crazy. But as the days went by, I realized that we had no choice. Miguel was changing. His eyes, once full of life, now seemed distant, as if he was always looking at something I couldn't see. At night, I could hear him talking to himself, laughing at jokes that no one had ever told him. "It's time," Carlos said one full moon night. "La Llorona will be stronger today. It's our best chance." With a heavy heart, I got Miguel ready for bed. "Mommy will protect you," I whispered, kissing his forehead. He smiled, but it wasn't my son's smile. It was something different. Carlos sprinkled salt around Miguel's bed and hung amulets from the windows. "This will keep her trapped when she comes in," he explained. "But remember, Sofia, you can't interfere, no matter what happens." We hid in the closet, watching through a crack. Time seemed to drag on. My heart was beating so loudly that I feared La Llorona might hear it. And then it happened. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically. The window opened with a bang and a cold mist invaded the room. And there she was, La Llorona, her white dress floating as if submerged, her black eyes fixed on Miguel. "Mi hijo," she whispered, her voice like the sound of turbulent waters. "Come with your mother." Miguel sat up in bed, his eyes glazed over. "Mama?" he called, but it wasn't for me. I had to stop myself from screaming, from running and grabbing my son. Carlos held my arm tightly, silently reminding me of the plan. La Llorona approached the bed, her arms outstretched towards Miguel. But when she crossed the salt line, something changed. She screamed, a terrible sound that made the windows shake. "Now!" Carlos shouted, jumping out of the closet. He started reciting words in a language I didn't know, holding the amulet out towards La Llorona. The specter was writhing, screaming in agony. I ran to Miguel, hugging him tightly. His eyes blinked back to normal. "Mom? What's happening?" But our victory was premature. With a cry of fury, La Llorona threw herself at Carlos. The amulet flew out of her hand, shattering on the floor. "Sofia!" Carlos shouted. "The river! You have to take her to the river!" Without thinking twice, I picked Miguel up and ran. I could feel La Llorona close behind, her wail echoing through the night. We arrived at the riverbank, panting. La Llorona hovered over the water, her eyes burning with hatred. "You can't have him," I shouted, squeezing Miguel against me. "He's my son." La Llorona hesitated, something changing in her gaze. I realized then that there was more to her story, more pain than the legend told. "You loved them, didn't you?" I asked softly. "Your children. You regretted it the moment it happened." A sob escaped the specter's lips. For the first time, I saw real tears in his eyes. Maybe it's time to let them go," I whispered, "to find peace." La Llorona looked at Miguel, then at me. Slowly, she nodded. With a final wail, her body began to dissolve into the river mist. When the sun rose, there was no sign of La Llorona, but the waters of the river seemed calmer, as if a weight had been lifted. Carlos met us on the bank. "You did it," he said, amazed. "You freed her." I hugged Miguel, tears of relief streaming down my face. The curse was over, but I knew that this experience would mark us forever. As we walked back home, I heard a whisper on the wind. "Gracias," the voice said, and for the first time in weeks, I felt no fear. Weeks had passed since our confrontation with La Llorona. Life seemed to have returned to normal, but something had changed inside me. I could no longer look at the river without remembering that night, without feeling a shiver run down my spine. Miguel, on the other hand, seemed to have recovered completely. He was back to being the cheerful, carefree boy he always was, as if it had all been just a distant nightmare. Sometimes I wondered if he really remembered what had happened. One afternoon, while we were playing in the yard, Miguel suddenly stopped, staring at the river. "Mommy," he said, his voice strangely serious for a 5-year-old. "The sad lady isn't sad anymore." I felt my heart racing. "What are you talking about, darling?" He pointed to the river. "She's there, see? She's smiling now." I followed his gaze, but saw nothing but the calm waters of the river. Still, I felt a presence, as if someone were watching us benevolently. That night, I dreamt of La Llorona, but it wasn't the terrifying specter I knew. It was a young woman with kind eyes and a sad smile. She held 2 children in her arms and looked at me with gratitude. "Gracias por liberarnos," she said softly before disappearing into the waters of the river. I woke up with tears in my eyes, a mixture of relief and melancholy enveloping me. In the days that followed, I began to research more about the legend of La Llorona. I discovered that there were many versions of the story, but they all spoke of a betrayed woman who, in a moment of madness and despair, drowned her own children. The more I read, the more I realized that La Llorona was not a monster, but a victim of her own tragedy. A woman who had carried the weight of her mistake for centuries, unable to find peace. Carlos visited me a few weeks later. He looked aged, as if the confrontation with La Llorona had taken years off his life. "You've done something extraordinary, Sofia," he said, sitting down heavily in my living room. "Few can break such an ancient curse." "I just talked to her," I replied, still unsure of how I had managed it. Carlos smiled. "Sometimes that's all a spirit needs, to be heard, to be understood." We were silent for a moment, the distant sound of the river filling the room. "What happens now?" I finally asked. "Now?" Carlos sighed. "Now you live, Sofia. But remember, once you see beyond the veil, there's no going back. The world will never be the same for you." He was right. In the months that followed, I began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. Shadows moving in the corner of my eyes, whispers in the wind that carried more than just noises. The river, once a place of fear, became a place of reflection for me. Sometimes, when the sun goes down and the mist rises over the water, I can swear I see a figure in white walking along the bank, no longer in despair, but in peace. The experience with La Llorona taught me a valuable lesson. Behind every legend, every horror story, there is a deeper truth, a story of pain, love, and redemption. And as I watch Miguel grow up, strong and happy, I know that I will always carry with me the memory of that night by the river, not as a nightmare, but as a reminder of the power of compassion, even in the face of the most terrible of ghosts. A year had passed since our encounter with La Llorona. Life took its course, but I never looked at the world the same way again. Every shadow, every reflection in the water, every whisper in the wind seemed to carry a secret. It was on an autumn afternoon that everything changed again. Miguel and I were walking by the river, the dry leaves crunching under our feet. Suddenly, he stopped, his eyes fixed on the water. "Mama," he said, his voice a mixture of excitement and fear. "There's someone calling." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you hear, darling?" He frowned, concentrating. "It's a little girl. She's crying." I looked at the river, but saw nothing but the turbulent waters. Still, something in the air had changed. Attention and expectation. "Let's go home, Miguel," I said, pulling him gently. But he resisted. "No, Mom. She needs help." Before I could react, Miguel ran towards the river. My heart raced when I saw him coming dangerously close to the bank.
Miguel, no.
I ran after him, panic consuming me. When I reached him, he was standing at the water's edge, staring at something I couldn't see. "Look, Mom," he whispered. "She's over there." Following his gaze, I saw a strange glow on the surface of the water. For a moment, I thought I saw the face of a little girl reflected there, her eyes full of tears. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. A soft voice, like the murmur of a stream, replied, "Help me, please." I realized then that it wasn't La Llorona. It was something, or someone, different. "What happened to you?" I asked, cautiously approaching the water. The voice answered, interspersed with sobs, I drowned here a long time ago. I can't find my way home." Miguel looked at me, his eyes full of compassion. "Can we help you, Mama?" I hesitated. After everything we'd been through with La Llorona, the idea of getting involved with another spirit terrified me. But looking at the pleading eyes of that little girl in the water, I knew I couldn't just walk away. "Yes," I finally answered. "Let's help her." At that moment, I had no idea how I was going to keep that promise. But I knew that, somehow, our encounter with La Llorona had prepared us for it. It was as if the river was calling us again, inviting us to dive deeper into its mysteries. As we walked back home, Miguel holding my hand tightly, I felt the weight of this new responsibility. What had begun as a struggle to protect my son had turned into something bigger. I looked up at the sky, the sun setting on the horizon, painting the river gold and red. I knew that our journey was far from over. In fact, it was only the beginning. "We'll find a way," I whispered to both Miguel and the girl in the river. "I promise." And so we prepared to plunge once again into the turbulent waters of the supernatural, not knowing what dangers or wonders awaited us. In the days that followed, my mind was consumed by the image of the girl in the river. Who was she? How could we help her? I knew I needed help, so I decided to look for Carlos again. I found him in his small esoteric store in town. When I told him about our experience, his eyes went wide. "Sofia," he said, his voice deep, "you are dealing with something very ancient and powerful. This river, it holds more secrets than we can imagine." Carlos explained to me that, over the centuries, many lost souls have met their end in those waters. Some, like La Llorona, have become legends. Others, like the girl we saw, were trapped between worlds, unable to move on. To help her, Carlos continued, "You'll need to delve into the history of the river, find out who she was and why she can't leave." He handed me an old leather book. "This grimoire contains rituals that can help you communicate with the spirits of the water. But be careful, Sofia. Not all spirits are benign." That night, Miguel and I sat by the river. The full moon reflected on the water, creating hypnotic patterns on the surface. Following the instructions in the grimoire, I lit candles and scattered herbs around us. "Spirit of the river," I called, my voice trembling slightly, "show us the lost girl." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the surface of the water began to ripple, and an image formed. It was the girl, but now we could see her clearly. She was wearing an old dress, probably from the early 20th century. Her eyes were full of sadness and fear. "What's your name?" I asked gently. "Isabel," she replied, her voice a distant echo. I don't remember much, just that I was running away from something, someone, and then the darkness swallowed me up. Miguel, who had been quiet until then, suddenly spoke. "Are you looking for your mother?" Isabel nodded, ghostly tears streaming down her face. "Yes, she must be looking for me. It's been so long." My heart squeezed. As a mother, I couldn't imagine the pain of losing a child in this way. "We'll help you find her," I promised. But when I tried to ask more, The image in the water began to distort. A cold wind blew, blowing out the sails. For a moment, I saw another figure in the water, a man with a cruel look on his face. Isabel screamed, and then everything disappeared. Miguel clung to me, trembling. "Mom, who was that bad man?" I hugged him tightly, my mind racing. Clearly, there was more to Isabel's story than a simple tragedy. Someone had chased her to the river. Someone who, perhaps, was still holding her there. As we walked home, I knew that we had only scratched the surface of this mystery. To help Isabel, we would have to unearth secrets long submerged in the depths of the river. And something told me that not everyone would like to see those secrets revealed. I looked at Miguel, who was walking silently beside me. He seemed older, wiser somehow. This world of spirits and secrets was shaping him, as it was shaping me. Are we doing the right thing? I asked myself silently. As if reading my thoughts, Miguel squeezed my hand. Let's help Isabel, Mama. She needs us. I nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and apprehension. Our journey had only just begun, and I knew that the challenges ahead would be greater than anything we had ever faced. But with Miguel by my side, I felt ready to face whatever the river had in store for us. The next morning, I decided it was time to investigate further. With Miguel at school, I dived into the archives of the local library, looking for any information about drownings in the river at the beginning of the 20th century. After hours of searching, I found something, a yellowed newspaper article from 1912. It talked about the disappearance of a girl called Isabel Montoya, age 12. She had disappeared after an argument with her stepfather, a man called Hector Ruiz. My blood ran cold when I read the name. Was this the man we saw in the water? I read on, my heart racing with every word. The article mentioned rumors that Hector was violent, but nothing was ever proven. Isabel's body was never found. I left the library with my head spinning. Now we had a name, a story, but that only raised more questions. Why couldn't Isabel leave? What really happened that fateful night? I decided to share my findings with Carlos. He listened attentively, his face becoming darker with every detail. "Sofia," he finally said, "this is more serious than we imagined. If Hector did something terrible to Isabel, her spirit may be trapped because of this unresolved injustice. How can we help her?" I asked, desperate for a solution. Carlos sighed heavily. "We need to find out the truth about what happened. And for that, maybe we need to talk to Hector himself." The thought of summoning that man's spirit terrified me, but I knew we had no choice. For Isabel's sake, I would face that fear. That evening, we returned to the river. Miguel insisted on coming, despite my protests. "I promised to help Isabel," he said with a determination that surprised me. We performed the ritual again, this time calling for Hector Ruiz. The air became heavy, charged with a dark energy. The surface of the river bubbled, and suddenly a man's face appeared in the water. His eyes were cold, cruel. "Who dares disturb me?" his voice thundered. I swallowed, gathering my courage. "We've come to find out the truth about Isabel Montoya. What did you do to her?" Hector laughed, a sound that made my hair stand on end. "Little Isabel. She was a stubborn little girl. She needed to be taught a lesson." Anger grew inside me. "Did you hurt her? Did you kill her?" Hector's face contorted with fury. "She ran away from me. I just wanted to discipline her. It's not my fault she was too weak to swim." Suddenly, the water exploded. Isabel appeared, her eyes blazing with rage. "Liar!" she shouted. "You pushed me in. You drowned me." The river began to churn violently. I pulled Miguel back, fearing that we would be swept away. "Isabel," I shouted above the roar of the water. "You have to let him go. He can't hurt you anymore." But Isabel was consumed by anger built up over decades. She advanced against Hector, their spectral forms merging into a maelstrom of water and light. It was then that Miguel stepped forward. "Isabel," he called, his voice surprisingly calm. "Your mother is waiting for you. She loves you. Don't let him keep you here." Miguel's words seemed to penetrate Isabel's fury. Slowly, the maelstrom began to calm down. Isabel turned to us, tears in her ghostly eyes. My mother, is she really waiting for me? I nodded, feeling tears in my own eyes. Yes, dear, it's time to go home. Isabel smiled, a real radiant smile. She took one last look at Hector, who seemed to be dissolving into the water. I forgive you, she said softly, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. With those words, a bright light enveloped Isabel. When it disappeared, the river was calm again. Isabel and Hector had left. Miguel turned to me, his eyes shining with emotion. She's found her way home, Mommy. I hugged my son, feeling a mixture of relief and wonder. Together, we had faced the past and freed a lost soul. As we walked back home, the river murmured softly behind us. Their secrets had been revealed, their lost souls finally at peace. But something told me that our journey with the supernatural was far from over. The river still held many mysteries, and now, somehow, we were part of them. Weeks have passed since we helped Isabel find peace. Life seemed to have returned to normal, but something had changed inside us. Miguel and I shared a secret, an understanding of the world that few possessed. One afternoon, as we walked along the riverbank, Miguel stopped abruptly. Mom, he said, his voice serious. I think the river wants to show us something. I followed his gaze and saw a strange shimmer in the water. We approached cautiously. The surface rippled and suddenly we saw images forming. People from different eras, all connected in some way to the river. They're the stories of the river, Miguel whispered in amazement. I realized then that the river was more than just flowing water. It was a repository of memories, of lives lived and lost over the centuries. Over the next few days, we began to listen to the river's stories. Some were of love and hope, others of tragedy and loss. There were Native Americans who revered the river as sacred, settlers who used it as a route, slaves who sought freedom in its waters. Carlos visited us, bringing old books and artifacts. You have been chosen, he told us. The river trusts you to keep its stories. I began to write down the stories we heard, feeling the weight of responsibility. Miguel, for his part, developed a talent for drawing the visions he had. But it wasn't all peaceful stories. Sometimes restless spirits came to us, seeking help to resolve unfinished business. Each case was unique. Each soul had its own journey. One evening, while I was working on my journal of river stories, Miguel came into my room, looking worried. Mom, he said, what if there are other places like our river? Other people who need help? His question took me by surprise, but I realized he was right. Our river couldn't be the only one with secrets to share. Maybe it's our mission to find out, I replied, hugging him. Over the next few months, we started traveling. We visited other rivers, lakes, and even the ocean. In each place, we found unique stories, lost souls, and mysteries to solve. Our house by the river became a kind of sanctuary. People from all over the world came to us, some seeking help in dealing with the supernatural, others simply wanting to hear the stories we had to tell. Michael grew not only in stature, but in wisdom and understanding. His gift for communicating with spirits grew stronger every day. One evening, sitting by our river, I reflected on the journey we had been on. From a frightened mother trying to protect her son, I had become a guardian of ancestral secrets. Miguel, for his part, was becoming an extraordinary young man, a bridge between two worlds. You know, Mom, Miguel said, looking out over the calm waters. I think I understand now why we moved here. It wasn't a coincidence. I nodded, feeling a wave of emotion. You're right, darling. The river chose us. As the sun set, dyeing the sky and water golden, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Our lives had been transformed in ways I could never have imagined. We had faced fears, unraveled mysteries, and helped lost souls find peace. And yet, I knew that our journey was far from over. The river continued to flow, carrying with it new stories, new challenges. I looked at Miguel, seeing in him not just my son, but a partner in this incredible adventure. Together, we were ready for whatever the future and the river had in store for us. Let the next chapter come, I whispered to the murmuring waters. And, as always, the river seemed to respond with a soft whisper of approval. Time passed and Miguel turned 15. Our knowledge and reputation grew, and with it came new responsibilities and challenges. One fall morning, we received a letter that would change everything. It was a plea for help from a small town in the Mississippi Delta. They spoke of an ancient curse, of waters turning against the residents, of missing children. "We have to go, Mama," Miguel said, his eyes shining with determination. I hesitated. This would be our furthest and most potentially dangerous mission. But something in the urgency of the letter told me we couldn't ignore it. We arrived in St. Marlow, Louisiana, on a humid afternoon. The town seemed to be under a veil of sadness. Century-old trees covered in moss overlooked almost deserted streets. We were greeted by Marie Laveau, a middle-aged woman with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "You've come," she said, relief in her voice. "The river is raging. We need your help before it's too late." That evening, Marie took us to where the Mississippi met the Gulf of Mexico. The waters were churning, foaming unnaturally. "The curse began generations ago," Marie explained. "Our ancestors made a pact with the spirit of the river to protect the city. But something has changed. The river is charging too high a price." Miguel approached the bank, his eyes fixed on the turbulent water. Suddenly, he gasped, "Mom, look!" On the surface of the water, I saw faces, dozens of them. Children, adults, the elderly. They all seemed trapped, their eyes pleading for help. "They're the souls the river took," Marie whispered. "They're trapped here, unable to move on." I felt a knot in my stomach. This was bigger than anything we had ever faced. "How can we help?" I asked. Marie hesitated. "There's an ancient ritual. It can break the pact and free the souls. But it requires a sacrifice." My heart froze. What kind of sacrifice? Someone must offer themselves to the river, voluntarily. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Miguel, seeing the understanding in his eyes. "I'll do it," he said calmly. "No," I shouted, grabbing his arm. There must be another way. But deep down, I knew. Miguel had always had a special connection with the spirit world. If anyone could do this, it was him. We spent the night researching, looking for alternatives. But when the sun rose, Miguel's resolve remained unwavering. "Trust me, Mom," he said, holding my hands. "I know what I'm doing." With heavy hearts, we prepared for the ritual. At midnight, under the light of the full moon, we gathered by the river. Miguel entered the water, reciting ancient words that Marie had taught us. The waters began to churn violently. Suddenly, a gigantic figure emerged from the waters. The spirit of the river, an ancient and powerful entity. "Who dares break the pact?" His voice thundered. Miguel, looking tiny in front of the entity, replied fearlessly, "I offer my life in exchange for the freedom of these souls and the protection of this city." The river spirit watched Miguel for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, it laughed. "I've been waiting a long time for someone like you, young man. Your courage and compassion are the true sacrifice I've been looking for." With a gesture, the spirit touched Miguel's forehead. A bright light enveloped my son. When the light dissipated, Miguel was different. His eyes shone with an ancient wisdom. "The pact is rewritten," the spirit announced. "This young man will be the guardian of the waters, a bridge between the worlds. The souls are free, and the city is protected." With these words, the spirit disappeared into the waters. The trapped souls began to rise, free at last. Miguel turned to me, smiling. "It's okay, Mom. This is my destiny." I hugged my son, tears in my eyes. Our world had changed once again, but now I understood. Our journey with the river had only just begun. As the sun rose over the delta, illuminating the now calm waters, I knew we would face many more challenges. But with Miguel as guardian of the waters, we were ready for anything that came our way. The river had chosen us, and now we finally understood why. The years that followed Miguel's transformation were ones of adaptation and discovery. "My son," now 18, had become a figure respected and sought after by people all over the world. His role as guardian of the waters took him to distant places, resolving conflicts between the world of the living and the realm of aquatic spirits. One summer afternoon, while I was organizing our increasingly extensive archive of supernatural cases, Miguel came home with a worried expression. "Mom," he said, his voice laden with urgency, "something is happening. The rivers, they're restless." We sat at the kitchen table, steaming cups of tea between us, while Miguel told me about the disturbances he was feeling. "It's not just a river or a lake," he explained. "It's a global upheaval, as if all the bodies of water were screaming." A shiver ran down my spine. After years of dealing with the supernatural, I knew that when Miguel spoke like that, it was serious business. "What can we do?" I asked, already imagining another journey ahead of us. Miguel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We need to go to the source, the place where all the world's rivers meet on the spiritual plane." "And where would that be?" I asked, curious and apprehensive. "In the heart of the Amazon," Miguel replied. "The meeting of the Negro and Solomois rivers. That's where the portal to the aquatic nexus is." Over the next few days, we prepared our expedition. Carlos, our old friend and mentor, insisted on accompanying us. "You're going to need all the help you can get," he said, his voice laden with concern. We arrived in the Amazon at flood time. The forest was partially submerged, creating a watery labyrinth of surreal beauty. Guided by natives who knew Miguel by reputation, we sailed.